He wasn't just a mad emperor, he was a nightmare wearing a crown. While Rome dreamed of glory, Caligula bathed it in fear. He laughed as starving children begged for bread. He raped noblewomen on their wedding day, sometimes right in front of their husbands. He ordered public executions not out of justice, but boredom. People died not for crimes, but for entertainment. He forced his enemies to kill themselves. If they didn't, he made them watch their families tortured first. No one was safe. Not the poor, not the rich, not even the Senate. And when Rome ran out of money, he accused its wealthiest citizens of treason just to steal their fortunes. He walked among marble halls lined with erotic paintings, dining on golden ships while his people starved in the streets. For Caligula, cruelty wasn't just a tool, it was pleasure. This is the chilling truth behind Rome's most monstrous emperor, a story of terror, insanity, and the empire that bled under his rule. Are you ready to look into the eyes of madness? When Caligula became emperor, Rome didn't gain a ruler. It inherited a storm of madness, humiliation, and pure evil dressed in royal robes. From the moment he took power, Caligula saw the Roman Senate not as wise men guiding an empire, but as pawns in his personal game of control and cruelty. He mocked their traditions, spat on their dignity, and twisted their authority into a circus of fear. Caligula, who once walked among them as a harmless young man, now sat on the throne like a god playing with insects. Senators, once proud and powerful, were reduced to trembling fools forced to run alongside his chariot like dogs, dressed in silk robes or sometimes nothing at all, sweating under the cruel Roman sun as Caligula whipped them or hurled rotten food from his golden carriage. In public ceremonies, he ordered them to kneel and kiss his feet, calling it a test of loyalty. But it was nothing more than a performance for his own laughter. He made them wait outside his palace for hours, sometimes days in the rain and cold, only to throw open the doors and shout insults, comparing them to worms or whores, and then slam the doors shut again. He delighted in watching them beg. The Senate, a body that had once ruled over provinces, armies, and the fate of kings, was now groveling at the feet of a madman who believed he was a god. One of his favorite games was to invite senators to banquets, serve them exotic meats and wine, and then suddenly command the guards to arrest them mid-meal, accusing them of treason. Some were dragged away screaming, their mouths still full of food, while others were forced to laugh and clap as their colleagues were beaten and executed in front of them. Turned into blood-soaked entertainment like a gladiator show for one man's amusement. Caligula's table became an altar of fear. He once asked a senator if he loved him. The senator, stammering with terror, said yes. Caligula smiled, reached into his tunic, pulled out a knife, and whispered, "Then die for me." That man was never seen again. Those who survived these feasts returned home pale and trembling, haunted by what they'd witnessed, knowing it could be them next time. Caligula even toyed with the idea of appointing his horse Incitatus as a senator, not as a joke, but as a message. He built the horse a marble stable, gave it servants, a golden collar, and made senators visit the animal and offer gifts, as if it were a divine official. This was not satire. This was power at its most perverse, turning politics into performance and tradition into terror. The Senate was no longer a place of reason. It was a theater of submission, a mirror reflecting the madness of one man who held all the strings. When a senator tried to protest, Caligula summoned him alone into a private chamber, and the man was never seen again. Rumors said he was slowly tortured over days, his cries echoing through the palace walls, ignored by servants too afraid to speak. Caligula often watched these tortures himself, sipping wine as bones broke and flesh burned, asking questions between screams like he was enjoying a play. And all this while, statues of gods were removed from temples and replaced with statues of Caligula, his face carved into marble, his name etched into prayers. Senators were required to worship him not as emperor, but as a living god. Any hesitation, any flicker of doubt, was punished with death. He even forced some senators to offer human sacrifices, often their own slaves, at altars dedicated to his image. And if they refused, he'd say, "You lack devotion," and have them dragged away to join the offerings. Rome, once proud and noble, was reduced to a shadow of its former self, and the Senate, the very heart of its power, was hollowed out and filled with fear. Under Caligula, the line between man and monster was blurred, and the Roman elite found themselves kneeling not to a ruler, but to a predator who saw their lives as toys to be broken for fun. They tried to smile. They tried to obey. But inside, they all knew one truth. The only thing more dangerous than disobeying Caligula was trying to understand him. He wasn't insane in the way people whisper about behind closed doors. He was worse. He was clear-eyed, clever, and cruel. His madness had purpose. And the Senate, Rome's once unshakable foundation, was now a stage where blood and power danced hand in hand. The emperor didn't just rule Rome, he humiliated it, from the top down, starting with the men who used to believe they were untouchable. Behind the towering marble walls of the Palatine Hill, Emperor Caligula orchestrated a theater of depravity that turned even Rome's darkest whispers into harsh, breathless truths. As the torchlight flickered across corridors lined with silk and gold, Caligula indulged in a level of incest and humiliation so disturbing it silenced even the boldest senators. His sisters, Drusilla, Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, were not simply members of the imperial family. They were forced players in a grotesque fantasy where the line between royalty and possession was obliterated. Drusilla, in particular, became the center of Caligula's twisted affections. He took her not as a sister but as a consort, parading her through Rome like a wife, inviting her into his bed in front of nobles, and at times making her sit beside him during imperial audiences like an empress. He referred to her as the light of his life, and when she died, his madness deepened into obsession. He halted all government functions for days, declared her a goddess, and ordered temples built in her honor, an immortalization of incest hidden behind divine pretense. Some say he even disemboweled a priest who refused to recognize her deification. Others whispered that he refused to burn her body until it began to decay, sleeping beside it, inhaling death, and calling it devotion. Caligula's cruelty wasn't reserved for family alone. It spilled into the streets and palaces, feeding off humiliation like a wild animal. He delighted in making powerful men grovel. Senators, once pillars of Roman dignity, were reduced to playthings. He would force them to race beside his chariot, naked in the heat of the day, their aged skin blistering as the crowds laughed. Others were made to kneel for hours, reciting praises to his manhood or begging to kiss his feet. And if one hesitated or flinched, they were dragged out and publicly flogged. He often invited senators' wives and daughters to dinner, only to vanish with them mid-feast and return moments later describing, in vulgar detail, what he had done to them in private chambers. Then, without shame or warning, he'd mock their performance or comment on their bodies in front of their husbands and fathers, reducing noble families to broken silhouettes, their honor bleeding out before the eyes of Rome. His lust knew no borders, not of blood, not of class, not of sanity. Slaves, virgins, newlyweds, none were safe from the emperor's appetite. He created a registry of Rome's most beautiful women and ordered them to present themselves at the palace. There they were inspected like livestock, chosen at will, and returned damaged in spirit and flesh. Even marriage became a mockery. At one public celebration, Caligula spotted a woman named Lollia Paulina. She was beautiful, poised, and recently married. Within hours, he had her dragged from her husband, violated her, and forced her into marriage, only to cast her aside days later. "She bored me," he laughed to the Senate. "I prefer the chase." In the halls of the palace, incest was not a secret. It was policy. Some records claim he impregnated his sister Drusilla, only to rip the fetus from her body when she died, mad with grief and superstition. He turned the palace into a maze of locked chambers where women were detained, abused, and displayed like artwork. There were no safe zones, no lines uncrossed. On more than one occasion, Caligula would force mothers to watch as their daughters were defiled, or demand fathers applaud as he humiliated their kin. He held power not as a right, but as a weapon, one he thrust into the heart of every Roman value. To the public, Caligula wore his madness like a crown. He strolled through markets dressed in Venus's silks, lips painted, giggling like a child as men bowed in fear. During festivals, he would stand on balconies with his sisters and make obscene gestures, laughing at the crowds below. The people no longer saw an emperor. They saw a god of depravity, untouchable and merciless. Statues were made in his image, not just of a ruler, but as a divine lover, a seductive tormentor. He commanded Rome not with laws, but with spectacle. He turned honor into ash and family into fodder. The empire's soul was bleeding, and its people were too terrified to scream. By the time Caligula began appointing his horse Incitatus to official positions, many assumed it was a joke. But it wasn't. It was his declaration that the Senate was so worthless, even an animal could outperform them. And he was right. The men who once ruled the Republic now bowed before a beast, their dignity stripped by the hands of a madman who fed on shame and incest and ruin. Caligula did not just rule Rome, he poisoned it, and the rot, once begun, would prove almost impossible to stop. Caligula didn't just rule Rome, he ruled every heartbeat that dared defy him. In the marble halls of the Senate, where once togas flowed with dignity and voices echoed with law, Caligula turned order into chaos, respect into ridicule. He despised the senators, not just for their politics, but for the simple fact that they existed at all. He believed Rome should have one voice, one God, one tyrant. And every senator was a threat to that fantasy. But instead of executing them all, he did something far worse. He made them crawl, he made them beg, and he made the Roman elite his personal circus. It began subtly. At first, Caligula summoned the Senate at impossible hours, sometimes in the dead of night, other times at dawn, and if any senator failed to appear instantly, he was accused of treason. One old senator died of a heart attack running to the palace barefoot in the rain. Caligula didn't blink. Then came the orders to attend barefoot, wearing women's clothing or painted with makeup. Imagine the might of Rome, the guardians of centuries of law, lined up in dresses and rouge, shivering not from cold but from sheer animal fear. Caligula would sit on a golden throne, laughing, tossing figs at them like beasts in a cage. He made them perform dances, sing songs, and even fight one another for his amusement, stripping the dignity of Rome's most respected men. But it got darker. In one instance, during a private banquet, Caligula ordered a senator's wife to stand naked on the table so the other guests could judge her body. When the senator protested, Caligula ordered the man's tongue removed, not by executioners, but by fellow senators who were told if they refused, they'd suffer worse. They obeyed. And as the man bled and screamed, Caligula toasted to the glory of Rome. No one dared weep. Then came the mock trials. Caligula created fake charges, treason, sorcery, even theft, and brought senators to trial in the palace garden. But there were no witnesses, no defenses, no laws. He would accuse a senator, force them to kneel, then ask the others if they thought the man was guilty. Those who said yes were spared. Those who said no were stripped naked, whipped, and sometimes sodomized in front of the court. He even forced the accused to dig their own graves while their families watched. But it wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was just to break their minds. He once invited all the senators to a surprise banquet, only to find it was held in the imperial brothel he had created inside the palace. Each senator was told to act as a client, and the women they were assigned to were their own wives or daughters, ordered by Caligula to perform. He stood behind a curtain, watching, sipping wine. Any refusal meant death, not just for the senator, but for their entire bloodline. Those who obeyed died inside, their dignity eaten alive. But the sickest twist was this. Caligula kept a tally. He documented which senators cracked first, which ones wept, which ones begged, and he had their performances painted in frescoes and displayed in the palace. Even foreign dignitaries would be walked past murals of Rome's most powerful men in humiliating poses, their legacies smeared in paint and shame. Then there was the infamous incident of the golden statues. Caligula ordered statues of the senators made, naked, deformed, grotesque exaggerations of their bodies, and placed them in the public latrines. Romans pissed on their likenesses, while Caligula laughed. Any senator who protested was told he could replace his statue, but only by stripping naked in the forum and enduring the same ridicule in person. One man, desperate to keep his family name clean, did it. He was mocked, spat on, and eventually driven mad. He threw himself into the Tiber 2 days later. Caligula sent flowers to his funeral, calling him a true Roman. The mockery didn't stop at Rome. When Caligula traveled to Gaul and Egypt, he brought senators along like pets. In Alexandria, he forced them to compete in public games, not in chariot races or poetry contests, but in eating competitions, nude wrestling, and even gladiator matches. A senator with a bad leg was forced to fight a real gladiator with a wooden sword. When the man cried for mercy, Caligula roared with laughter and had his leg broken. He was left in the arena overnight, naked, until he died from the cold. Caligula then wrote a poem about the incident, titled "The Senator Who Couldn't Run." He read it aloud in the Senate the next week. Silence, always silence. No one dared laugh. No one dared breathe. There was no resistance, only submission. He poisoned them slowly, not with wine or herbs, but with fear. He trained them like animals, killed their pride, buried their honor. He even replaced senators with actors and slaves, seating jesters in togas on official benches. Real senators had to stand beside them, nodding respectfully. Once, during a Senate session, a jester threw food at a senator's face. The senator thanked him for the honor. And when rumors began to spread that some senators were plotting to restore dignity, Caligula invited them to a meeting of minds. But there were no chairs, no scrolls, no debates, only ropes. Each senator was blindfolded, tied, and led one by one to a courtyard where Caligula stood with a whip, smiling. "Let's discuss Rome," he whispered. He beat them himself, personally. Some were flayed, some were castrated, all were broken. He told them it was an experiment, to see how much pain a man could endure before he lost the will to live. Then when they collapsed, he'd order the palace physicians to patch them up, just enough to keep them breathing, and send them home. Their silence after that was the loudest scream in Rome. He didn't need assassins or soldiers. Caligula ruled the Senate with humiliation, with nightmare, with insanity weaponized. He turned the state's most sacred institution into a stage for his darkest theater. The senators were not men. They were props, puppets in a mad emperor's circus. And the worst part? The audience was the empire. Everyone watched, no one stopped it. There are tyrants in history, and then there is Caligula, a man whose very whims could sentence anyone to death. By the time his reign reached its peak, Rome had grown numb to his cruelty. But even in that numbness, there were moments so unspeakable that even hardened soldiers winced. Caligula did not kill for justice. He didn't kill for politics. He killed because it amused him. Death to him was a toy. Power was a flame he waved in the faces of those too afraid to flinch. And when that flame burned someone alive, he laughed. There was once a story told in whispers among the guards. Caligula stood near a cliff during a leisurely stroll when a man caught his eye. Just an ordinary Roman. No crime, no insult, nothing. Caligula turned to a soldier and said with a bored yawn, "Throw him off." The man screamed, arms flailing, terror pouring out of his mouth as he plummeted to his death. But Caligula wasn't finished. He leaned over the edge and mocked the sound, repeating it in a high-pitched voice, turning it into a twisted joke for his entourage. Laughter followed, nervous, forced, fearful laughter, because no one knew who was next. What Rome came to understand, too late, was that Caligula didn't see humans as people. He saw them as props in a theater of violence. One day he invited a crowd to the Colosseum and promised a unique show. The audience, always eager for blood, filled the seats. But instead of gladiators or beasts, he ordered a random section of the crowd, dozens of men and women, to be dragged into the arena. No reason, no explanation. He merely waved his hand and the killing began. Swords tore through flesh while the emperor clapped, tossing bread to the spectators like they were dogs. Another tale whispered behind palace walls involved a man who asked for mercy. A minor official, guilty of a small administrative mistake. He was brought before Caligula to plead his case. The emperor listened with a straight face, then said, "I forgive you." The man wept with relief. But before he could thank the emperor, Caligula gestured to the guards. "Now kill him for thinking I'd let him live." He watched as the man was dragged away, his screams echoing through the halls like a melody to Caligula's madness. His murders weren't always public. Sometimes they were intimate, cruel, cold. He would invite senators or nobles to private dinners, feeding them delicacies while whispering insults with a smile. If one of them offended him, even by blinking at the wrong time, they might find their family executed before morning. Wives raped, sons thrown into prison, daughters sold into slavery. Caligula didn't just punish the person, he destroyed their bloodline. Because he could, because he wanted to. One slave once said that working in the imperial palace was like living in the shadow of a knife. At any moment, Caligula could snap, not in rage, but in curiosity. He once asked, "What does a man look like the moment before death?" And instead of wondering, he tested it. He picked a random servant, slit his throat, and watched his face as life slipped away. His conclusion? Not as dramatic as the poets say. During a banquet, Caligula grew bored with the conversation. So he told his guards to bring in prisoners, criminals, dissenters, or just the unlucky. He lined them up in front of the guests, and one by one he ordered their deaths. The executions were brutal. Some beheaded, some stabbed, others set on fire. Caligula handed drinks to his horrified guests and told them to toast to Rome's cleansing. When one guest refused to drink, he was added to the lineup. His crime? Displeasing the emperor's mood. He once passed a man on the street who didn't bow fast enough. Caligula ordered the man's tongue removed. Not just killed, mutilated, humiliated, erased. He wanted people to remember the cost of hesitation. His guards were trained not just to kill, but to obey without thought. One commander said that Caligula's greatest weapon wasn't his army, but his unpredictability. "We don't fear death," the man said. "We fear being noticed." And that fear was exactly what Caligula wanted. In another episode, he promised freedom to a group of prisoners if they could win a foot race. Shackled and starving, they ran for their lives while Caligula watched, betting on who would make it the farthest. But before anyone could finish, he ordered archers to shoot them down. Freedom, he said, is just another illusion. Even children weren't safe. There's a tale, likely true, where a senator's young son made the mistake of laughing at something Caligula said. The emperor asked what was so funny. The child, no older than 10, said, "You sounded silly." That night, Caligula summoned the senator. The man begged for forgiveness, saying his son was young and didn't understand. Caligula agreed. He said, "You're right. Children don't understand." And then he had the boy strangled in front of his father. He left the corpse lying on the Senate steps as a warning. One of the darkest moments of his rule came when he asked an artist to design a new method of execution, one that was more entertaining. The result? A machine that slowly crushed a man's limbs while keeping him alive for hours. Caligula used it once on a poet who wrote a satire about the emperor's hair. The screams lasted nearly a day. Caligula visited the man between meals, amused by the slow, wet sounds of bone and sinew breaking apart. "Art," he said, "should suffer." These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns, rituals. A man consumed not by madness alone, but by a hunger to feel something, anything out through death. And yet Rome endured. The Senate cowered. The people stayed silent. Because when cruelty becomes common, resistance feels impossible. But even as corpses piled beneath his throne, Caligula wasn't done. The blood hadn't satisfied him yet. He needed more. And in the chapters to come, Rome would find out just how much darker the emperor's heart could go. In the heart of the Roman Empire, when the people of the city cried out in desperation for food, Emperor Caligula did not answer with compassion. He responded with silence, followed by laughter. The famine that gripped Rome during Caligula's reign was not entirely natural. While grain supplies from Egypt and other provinces were delayed or disrupted, what turned a shortage into mass starvation was Caligula himself. With his hands gripping every shipment of food that entered the city gates, the emperor decided to turn hunger into a performance. He hoarded Rome's grain, not in secret, but openly, storing mountains of food behind the palace gates where no citizen could reach it. The starving poor gathered in the streets. Mothers with gaunt faces held out their children in front of the palace, begging for a handful of grain to stop the cries that kept them awake at night. And yet Caligula looked down from his balconies with a goblet of wine in one hand and roasted meat in the other. To him, their suffering was not a crisis. It was a stage, and he was the audience. Some whispered that he invited senators to join him in his palace courtyards, not to discuss relief or strategy, but to watch the spectacle unfold. From their safe perch above the forum, they would point and chuckle at the chaos as riots erupted over crumbs. In one infamous instance, a shipment of grain finally arrived from Alexandria. The people rejoiced, thinking their prayers had been answered. But Caligula intercepted the shipment and redirected it, not to the starving citizens, but to his private docks, where he used the grain to fill the luxurious compartments of his floating palaces. These weren't ships meant for war or transport. They were floating feasts, complete with gold ceilings, marble floors, and fountains of wine. Caligula dined on the grain meant for thousands, while thousands died in the streets. When he grew bored of the Hunger Games, he announced a grand auction of Rome's own grain supply, selling it back to the desperate public at absurd prices. Families sold their homes, jewelry, and daughters into slavery just to afford a few weeks' worth of bread. And what did Caligula do with the profits? He ordered the construction of more palaces and statues, one of which was a towering golden likeness of himself with outstretched hands, as if mocking the people begging at its feet. He even commissioned a special amphitheater where he hosted performances meant to parody the starving. He forced the poor to act out their hunger in front of cheering crowds, making them grovel for scraps, drink sewage in place of wine, and crawl across the arena like animals. all for a handful of copper coins tossed from the imperial box. And when a senator dared to protest this mockery, Caligula responded with a brutal display. He summoned the senator's wife and children, dressed them in rags, and marched them through the streets while shouting, "Behold, a Roman noble's idea of dignity." He then declared the man's estate confiscated and used it to throw a banquet where guests were encouraged to eat until they vomited, while the poor clawed at the gates outside. The cruelty did not stop there. Caligula used starvation as leverage, forcing people into submission. He offered grain not for loyalty, but for humiliation. Noble women were ordered to dance naked in the palace in exchange for food to feed their children. Fathers were told to kneel and bark like dogs or watch their sons starve. Entire neighborhoods were given a single loaf of bread to fight over, and Caligula would watch from a distance, smiling at the violence that erupted. Rome, once the center of the civilized world, had become a circus of pain. Its emperor, the ringmaster, its people, the animals. Hunger was not a misfortune under Caligula. It was a tool, a game, a punishment, and an art form. He proved that even without swords or crucifixions, an emperor could kill slowly, one empty stomach at a time. And while bones piled up in alleys and funerals became as common as rain, Caligula feasted, danced, and laughed. The empire did not weep for him yet, but the streets remembered. The cries of starving children echoed louder than the cheers of any theater. And beneath the marble floors of Caligula's banquets, the rage of the forgotten began to boil. Fear, that was the empire's true ruler. Not marble statues, not silver coins stamped with Caligula's twisted grin. Not even the Senate, groveling like animals at his feet. No, fear ruled Rome, and Caligula made sure of it, one death at a time. Loyalty meant nothing. Truth meant even less. If you served him with all your heart, you were a fool. If you hesitated, you were already a corpse. But the worst fate wasn't to be executed. The worst fate was to be loved by Caligula and then thrown to the wolves. He didn't always send executioners. Sometimes he sent a letter, a short message written with a casual hand, no emotion, just an order. Take your own life before sunset. And if you were wise, you did. Because if you didn't, the punishment was a nightmare so twisted, so inhuman, it makes the skin crawl even today. First, the guards would come, not to kill you, but to gather your family. Your wife, your sons, even the youngest daughter. They'd be dragged into the palace, chained and bruised, trembling in the torchlight. And you, the accused, would be forced to stand and watch what happened next. One man was tied to a chair while Caligula slit his daughter's throat in front of him, then made him drink her blood before cutting out his tongue so he couldn't scream. Another noble, accused of plotting behind the emperor's back, begged to be killed quickly. Caligula denied him. Instead, he made the man eat a meal while his wife was flayed alive beside him, each bite punctuated by a fresh scream. When Caligula was finished with the family, he'd turn to the man and smile. Now he'd say, "You may die." And then he'd walk away as if nothing had happened. Even his closest advisors lived in daily terror. He once asked a senator if he loved him. The senator answered yes, of course. Caligula handed him a dagger and said, "Then prove it." The man hesitated. That was enough. His son was dragged into the room, his limbs broken one by one, while the father wept. "You could have saved him," Caligula whispered, "if you had just obeyed." Then he gave the man one last chance. "Kill yourself, or we'll start on your wife next." Sometimes Caligula let them live, but not out of mercy. No, he let them live broken, insane, their minds shattered from what they had seen. He'd pass them in the street later, point and laugh as they flinched. It was all entertainment to him. Torture wasn't punishment, it was theater. He even invented a game for his guards. Find the most loyal man in Rome, and I'll make him betray himself. They'd pick at random, soldiers, scribes, governors. Then Caligula would break them slowly. He'd send false letters to confuse them, arrest their friends to shake them, then offer them impossible choices. Kill a loved one or be killed yourself. The results amused him endlessly. One general slit his own throat after 3 days of silence. Caligula applauded. Another senator ran naked through the palace, screaming nonsense, after watching his brother eaten alive by trained dogs. Caligula called it art. Even his own uncle Claudius wasn't safe. He'd mock the man for his stutter, then command him to write glowing praises of Caligula's mercy while slaves were beaten behind him. "Write it louder," Caligula would shout. "They can't hear you over the screaming." And if the words weren't flowery enough, the whip came next. Nobody slept peacefully in Rome. Not while Caligula was emperor. Every whisper might be betrayal. Every glance might be treason. And worst of all, no one ever knew why they were being targeted. One day you were a guest at his feast. The next you were locked in a cage being forced to eat glass. Some tried to flee, but Caligula had spies everywhere. Men who would slit their own mother's throat if he asked. He paid them in power, in secrets, in the thrill of watching terror bloom across a good man's face. The emperor loved loyalty, but only the kind that made people destroy themselves. His soldiers lived in agony too. If they disobeyed, they died. If they obeyed too well, they became a threat. He once accused a captain of standing too straight, said it was a sign of arrogance. The man begged forgiveness. Caligula pardoned him, then had his spine snapped in front of the troops as an example. "Let's see how straight he stands now," he laughed. Fear became the empire's new law. Love your emperor, but not too much. Obey him, but never think you're safe. Every letter might be a death sentence. Every nod might be your last. Caligula didn't just rule Rome, he infected it, turned it into a city of whispers, screams, and suicide notes. And the worst part, the people stopped resisting. After a while, they stopped crying. They stopped hoping. Because in Caligula's Rome, death was mercy. It was the waiting that drove you mad. It was knowing that no matter how loyal you were, no matter how much you gave, it would never be enough. Because Caligula didn't want obedience. He wanted suffering, and he got it. There are tyrants in history whose cruelty lives on in memory, but few descend to the depths of depravity that Caligula did, not merely as a ruler of Rome, but as a destroyer of human dignity. His lust was not passion, it was power. His bedroom became a court of terror, a place where names were erased, marriages destroyed, and souls crushed under the weight of imperial desire. What Caligula wanted he took, not with seduction or persuasion, but with a look, a nod, a snap of his fingers. And no one could say no. To refuse was death, to weep was weakness, and to scream was entertainment. When he looked out over a banquet hall or walked through the corridors of his palace, he didn't see people. He saw objects, objects to use, to defile, to break. He once interrupted a wedding ceremony of two Roman nobles, friends of his own court, and nullified the union on the spot. Not through legal process, but by standing up and declaring, "This is mine now." Before the guests could even react, Caligula dragged the bride into a side room and raped her, while the groom stood outside, trembling, powerless, and humiliated. Afterward, Caligula returned to the feast and mocked the groom for his wife's screams. He said she had enjoyed it. He made the couple sit beside him for the rest of the night while he described what he had done in detail, laughing with a goblet of wine in his hand as if he were retelling a joke. But that was only the beginning. Caligula would invite senators and their families to dinner, not for politics or diplomacy, but for theater, his kind of theater. He would dine with a man, flatter his wife, and then take her by the hand in full view of the guests, disappearing with her for hours. When he returned, he would either mock her performance like a critic or announce that she had disappointed him, only to offer her to his guards as if passing around scraps. Sometimes he forced husbands to watch as their wives were brutalized. Other times he'd forced noblemen to prostitute their wives and daughters as a test of loyalty. If they refused, their homes would be seized, their names scratched from public record, and they would vanish from the world without even a whisper. The people of Rome had long understood the dangers of disobedience under tyrants, but under Caligula, even silence could be fatal. One senator, fearing the emperor's interest in his daughter, sent her away to the countryside. Caligula responded by having the senator stripped, beaten, and dragged through the forum. Then he brought the girl back to Rome and paraded her around in chains. He invited Rome's most perverse elites to watch her defilement. Her father was made to serve wine during the event. Not even children were safe. There are whispers, dark and chilling, that Caligula's cruelty extended to the youngest and most innocent. It's said he kept a private chamber in his palace, filled not with marble or gold, but silence and muffled cries. There, young boys and girls stolen from noble families or plucked from the streets were kept as living dolls. He dressed them, renamed them, and subjected them to rituals that would scar them for life, if they were lucky enough to survive. Slaves tasked with cleaning the chamber would later describe finding scratches on the walls, fingernails torn off, and hair in places it didn't belong. Some whispered of screams that never stopped echoing. When confronted, Caligula simply smiled and said, "They amuse me." And Rome did nothing. Rome watched. Even his own sisters were not spared. Caligula's obsession with Drusilla, the sister he allegedly loved more than any other, was the stuff of legend. But that love was not brotherly. It was possessive, unholy. From childhood, he had claimed her as his, keeping her close even after she married. When Drusilla fell ill and died, Caligula didn't just mourn. He lost what little control remained in him. He declared her a goddess, ordered temples built in her name, and then spiraled into deeper madness. Some say he kept her body for days, whispering to it, sleeping beside it, refusing burial. Others say he forced women to dress like her, speak like her, and serve him as replacements. It was as if he were trying to resurrect her, not in memory, but in flesh. After Drusilla, Caligula turned to his other sisters, Livilla and Agrippina. He paraded them around in sheer garments, held family banquets where the lines between kin and concubine blurred, and whispered disturbing things in public. Once at a gladiator show, he turned to a guest and said, "Would you like to taste the emperor's sisters? They're ripe tonight." What was once scandal became custom. What was once rumor became law, and still no one dared to speak. What made Caligula's sexual cruelty so monstrous was not only the act, it was the way he made others complicit. He turned Roman virtue into a mockery. He shattered moral codes and rewrote them in his image. Chastity became cowardice. Modesty became treason. He created a Rome where decency was weakness and corruption was currency. His guards would storm homes in the middle of the night, dragging women and boys from their beds for the emperor's inspection. If he liked what he saw, they vanished into his palace. If not, they were returned, bruised, broken, and silenced. And if anyone asked where they had been, they were told to be grateful they had returned at all. But Caligula was not content with violating bodies. He wanted to break spirits. He didn't just use sex to satisfy lust. He used it to destroy pride, ruin names, and erase boundaries between family, state, and self. He once raped a senator's wife, then forced the senator to write a speech praising the emperor's generosity. He had artists paint erotic scenes of noblewomen he had defiled and hung the portraits in public halls. He funded stage plays reenacting his crimes, casting the husbands as cuckolds and the wives as willing participants. And Rome laughed, or pretended to. Because to frown was to invite suspicion, to protest was to die. By the end of his reign, Roman society itself began to collapse under the weight of his perversion. Marriages lost meaning. Fatherhood became shameful. Women walked the streets in silence, eyes lowered, hands trembling. Men no longer protected their families. They negotiated their survival. And all the while, Caligula ruled from his throne of marble and madness, declaring himself a living god while drowning the city in moral filth. He believed he could do anything, touch anyone, destroy anyone, and remake Rome in his image. And for a time, he was right. But beneath the glittering palace walls, behind every masked smile and every trembling bow, hatred grew like a wildfire in silence. The people did not forget, the victims could not forgive, and somewhere in the shadows, knives began to sharpen. There are tyrants who kill to maintain power, and then there was Caligula, who killed for pleasure. Beneath the marble arches of Rome's grand arenas, and within the shaded courtyards of the imperial palace, cruelty itself was reinvented, sharpened into something theatrical and obscene. What Caligula crafted was not mere execution. It was a form of entertainment, a twisted game in which agony was applause and human lives were discarded like broken toys. He didn't just murder, he choreographed suffering. In one recorded horror, a man was sentenced to death, not for crime or treason, but because Caligula wanted to test if his new sword was sharp enough. And so he stood there smiling, testing blade after blade on living flesh. But the most gut-wrenching were the executions turned into family affairs. Caligula found joy in symmetry. What better symmetry than a child watching a father butchered in front of them? Sometimes he would allow the children to run to their doomed parents, only to be torn away by guards. Other times, he had the parent tied down and forced to watch as their child was flogged, maimed, or beheaded before their very eyes. The screams of love and horror mingled until they became white noise in the palace air. It wasn't just spectacle, it was control. Total, suffocating, dehumanizing control. And Caligula savored every second. Once a nobleman was brought before him accused of nothing at all, but Caligula, bored and itching for something memorable, ordered that his entire family be brought in. First, the man's wife was stripped naked and paraded before senators while Caligula commented on her body with mock disgust. Then she was chained and whipped, while her husband begged for mercy. Caligula responded by having their sons beaten to death with clubs, one after the other, slow and deliberate, forcing the man to watch as the blood pooled around his feet. Then he finally allowed the husband to die, only after gouging out his eyes, so his final moments were spent in darkness. The emperor didn't even flinch. On other occasions, he would invite guests to a banquet and serve food, while a man was being disemboweled on a nearby platform. When the diners recoiled, Caligula would laugh and say, "Why are you afraid of a little blood? He's not complaining." He even made wagers with his guards, betting on how long someone would survive torture or which body part would snap first under pressure. In one case, a senator's daughter refused his advances, and Caligula responded by having her stripped and tied to a pillar in the Senate chamber itself, where he violated her in front of her father, then handed her over to his guards. Afterward, he allowed the father to live, just long enough to see her decay into madness. But the games weren't only for the palace. Caligula brought them to the people. He once halted a grain shipment to fund a special gladiatorial show, and when the starving masses booed, he had 100 men thrown into the arena, not to fight, but to be torn apart by beasts without weapons. They wanted a show, he said, so let them choke on it. He delighted in novelty killings, like dressing a man in a lamb's wool tunic and unleashing wild dogs to rip him apart, or sewing two prisoners together back to back and calling them the double traitor before lighting them on fire. The laughter that followed wasn't joy, it was fear, forced out of throats too terrified to be silent. And still he demanded more. He once asked a mother whether she loved her son. When she said yes, he ordered the boy's limbs broken one by one. "Still love him?" he asked. When she screamed and fainted, he had her revived with boiling water and made her watch as the boy was flayed alive. These were not stories whispered after his death. They were acts committed in broad daylight, documented, sometimes applauded by those too spineless to resist. He replaced honor with terror, and Rome became his theater of pain. Even his own guards were not immune. One soldier, accused of giving a disapproving glance, was forced to dig his own grave, stand in it, and clap while Caligula poured wine into his mouth and described how his guts would feel being pulled from his belly. Then when the man collapsed from shock, Caligula stabbed him slowly, watching the life fade from his eyes like a child watching a candle burn out. The emperor didn't stop at death. He erased dignity. He made suffering into sculpture. He turned agony into architecture. Rome's grandeur became the backdrop for nightmares no poet could romanticize. The stones were soaked in the blood of mothers, sons, daughters, and husbands. None spared, all replaceable, all tools in the emperor's endless appetite for domination and delight. To Caligula, human life was a toy, a fragile, weeping toy, and breaking it was the only game worth playing. Rome once stood as the wealthiest empire the world had ever seen, its coffers brimming with the spoils of war, the taxes of provinces, and the sweat of countless slaves. But under Caligula, the gold didn't go toward building roads, protecting borders, or feeding the people. No, Caligula had his own vision for wealth, and it was soaked in greed, madness, and perversion. The empire's treasury, carefully stocked by Augustus and maintained by Tiberius, was emptied like wine at one of Caligula's endless orgies. He believed Rome existed for one purpose, to entertain him, and he would sacrifice everything to his twisted pleasures. He built floating palaces on the sea, massive ships plated with gold, furnished with marble floors and rooms for sexual play. These weren't ships for war or travel. They were temples to his lust, meant to drift lazily while he indulged in every forbidden urge, surrounded by wine, music, and the bodies of slaves dressed like gods. He threw banquets so obscene that even the wealthiest nobles blushed. Dishes of peacock tongues, flamingo brains, and pearls dissolved in vinegar were served while guests watched naked dancers bleed themselves for entertainment. At one feast, he ordered bread to be soaked in molten gold, meant to symbolize how Rome itself was being consumed for his appetite. The cost of his games was unthinkable. Gladiator battles were staged not for sport, but to punish. He ordered hundreds to fight at once, then complained when there wasn't enough blood on the sand. When animals ran low, he didn't hesitate. He sent criminals, slaves, and even innocent citizens into the arena, laughing as lions tore through flesh. The seats of these bloody spectacles were covered in silk and gems, while the poor stood starving in the streets outside. When the money finally began to run out, and it did, Caligula didn't stop. He simply changed his targets. He accused Rome's wealthiest citizens of imaginary crimes, treason, disrespect, failure to praise him as a living God. Once accused, their fates were sealed, their homes were seized, their families were humiliated, and their gold was funneled directly into the emperor's hands. He even forced the sons of wealthy men to pay for their fathers' executions. Some were made to bid against each other for the right to bury their own dead. If someone refused, Caligula would order the corpse dragged through the streets and dumped in the Tiber. The Senate, once the proud heart of Rome's political power, became his piggy bank. He auctioned off their positions to the highest bidder. He demanded tribute for every word spoken in the Senate chamber. One senator who hesitated to pay found his wife stripped naked and paraded before the guards. Then he was executed anyway. He didn't stop there. Caligula established brothels inside the imperial palace and forced high-born women into service. Patrons were charged outrageous fees that Caligula pocketed himself. He made noble families watch as their daughters were sold like slaves to Roman drunkards and degenerates, all while he lounged nearby, sipping wine, smiling at their shame. When even that wasn't enough, he turned to the temples. He robbed the sacred treasures of Rome's gods, melted golden statues and stripped altars of offerings. He declared that the gods had given him permission, that they were pleased to be robbed by their equal. Priests who protested were whipped or executed. In one infamous case, he tore down a temple to build a golden stable for his horse, Incitatus. Caligula called it a gift to Rome. By the end of his reign, Rome was not only bankrupt, it was broken. Roads fell into disrepair. Grain shipments were delayed or stolen. Troops went unpaid. Provinces were taxed to the brink of rebellion, and disease spread in the slums like wildfire. But inside the palace, Caligula still lived like a pharaoh, surrounded by golden statues of himself, lounging on silk sheets, feeding grapes to a monkey dressed as a senator. He smiled, because for him, the suffering outside was the real entertainment. He had turned an empire into his personal playground and emptied its soul for his amusement. They had endured his madness long enough. Behind the walls of the Palatine, fear turned into hatred, and hatred into quiet rebellion. Caligula, once the golden-haired heir, the beloved little boots of the Roman legions, had become an uncontrollable beast wrapped in silk, drunk on blood and praise. Senators whispered, guards trembled, and even the marble statues of the gods seemed to avert their gaze when he passed. His cruelty had no logic. He executed men for bad dreams, mocked the screams of the dying, and demanded temples be built to honor himself as a living god. He raped brides on their wedding nights, killed parents before their children's eyes, and laughed as famine turned Rome's people into skeletons begging for bread he had locked away. But monsters grow careless when they believe themselves immortal, and Caligula, in his arrogance, didn't notice that the shadows in his own palace had turned against him. Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard whom Caligula mocked for being effeminate, took the first step. He'd had enough of the insults, the humiliation, the endless parade of horror. So he conspired with fellow officers, men who had seen too much, lost too much, and had no future under a mad god. They planned it during the Ludi Palatini, a festival Caligula adored. It would be poetic, blood spilled beneath the very stage of his self-worship. On the day of the assassination, January 24th, 41 AD, Caligula entered a private passage under the Palatine Stadium, strutting like a demigod. He had no idea he was walking into his own slaughter. A small group of guards closed in. Chaerea struck first, driving his sword into Caligula's neck while yelling the signal, "Take that!" Caligula stumbled backward, eyes wide with disbelief. The emperor bled like any other man. The guards followed, blades flashing, stabbing again and again, his chest, his belly, his face, until the once divine ruler lay in a twitching, unrecognizable heap. But the fury did not end with his death. His pregnant wife Caesonia was dragged from her quarters and hacked apart, her brains dashed against the marble. Their infant daughter, barely able to walk, was swung by the legs and smashed into a wall until her skull split. This was not justice. It was rage finally uncaged. The Senate, long humiliated, rejoiced. They rushed to erase his memory. His statues toppled, his name scratched from records. But Rome had no plan. The city was bleeding, traumatized, leaderless. The people, starved and broken, stumbled through the ashes of Caligula's reign, unsure whether to grieve or celebrate. Even his assassination wasn't clean. It was an act of desperation, not reform. Chaos bloomed in his absence. The Praetorians, fearing their power would be stripped away, installed his uncle Claudius as emperor, an awkward, stuttering man thought to be a fool. And so Rome lurched forward, wounded and unsure, led by a puppet chosen not by the Senate, but by the same guards who once hailed Caligula as a god. His legacy festered like a wound, proof that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it devours, mutilates, and spreads. Even after his death, rumors swirled that his ghost haunted the Palatine. Servants heard footsteps, screams in the night, and saw blood trailing across stone floors where no one walked. His cruelty had been so great, so unnatural, that many believed it tore a hole in the very soul of Rome. Caligula wasn't merely assassinated, he was exorcised. And yet, even with his body burned and memory cursed, the empire never truly healed. Because Caligula was not just one man's madness. He was what happens when a god is given a human body, when fear silences every voice of reason, when cruelty becomes theater and power becomes a blood sport. He was Rome without restraint, and Rome in all her greatness had created him. If this descent into madness shook you, don't look away now. There's more horror buried in the ashes of ancient Rome. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to uncover the twisted secrets of emperors who ruled with blood and fear. Because the past wasn't just brutal, it was insane, and we're just getting started.